thanks for being here at the ISWI. So the motto for this ISWI is global justice. The motto for this ISWI is global justice, a fairy tale. So what did you personally define as global justice, or is it actually so easy to answer? What does global justice mean?
Global justice is not easy to answer because people from different cultures, different parts of the world, different religious frameworks and all can have slightly different specific interpretations of what global justice might or might not be. But I think there are certain things that are quite commonly shared. One is an economic system that is much more fairer than the one that we have now, where in fact the wealth of society is more equitably shared. We cannot accept that 65 people in the world own more than what 60% of people at the bottom half of the world owns. An economic system that allows that level of inequality is a disaster and must be addressed, and that would be a part of what we would seek to achieve through a more just world. The fact that the second point is that humanity is now threatened by the realities of climate change. It was driven by overconsumption, economic exploitation, and so on. And addressing climate change in such a manner that is sensitive to the historical responsibilities, but also forward-looking, because what is at stake with climate change is the survival of humanity as we know it, and our children and their children's futures, and coming up with a solution that is globally applicable and can see the world community coming together to address reducing our emissions and generating new industries that are clean and so on is part of it. There are many other aspects of global justice, but I think I would say addressing the question of social exclusion. You know, when we talk about social exclusion, we think it impacts on minorities, like, people living with HIV/AIDS, people with alternative sexual orientations, cultural and linguistic minorities, and so on. But actually, when you add to that women, young people, older people, and so on, actually the majority of people in the world are actually socially excluded. So one of the questions we have to ask in terms of seeking a more just world is what kind of democratic institutions that we need, and people need to be cautious moving forward that simply having an election doesn't guarantee democracy when the elections are manipulated and so on. So the last thing I would say, global justice must also include historical redress. So, for example, looking at the question of indigenous peoples of the world who were victims of genocide, in the Americas, in Australia, New Zealand, and so on, and ensuring, even though we can't reverse that history, ensuring that indigenous communities have the respect that they deserve and the support to actually maintain the cultures is one example of a socially excluded constituency, amongst others, that need to be addressed by Quest for Genuine Global Justice.
All right. So there are many points where to start. It's like I hear from you, it's not easy to just say, I'm going to start there and then the next thing can happen. And do you need to start at every site? So there are many building places, like I hear from you. So is there any point which is more important, or is it more complicated?
Well, this is a good question. Where one chooses to start their intervention or to continue their efforts to contribute to a better world, there is not one answer for that. We should not seek one answer for that, because it is human beings that created these problems in the world, and it's human beings that need to actually sort it out. And human beings have very different starting points. If you grew up in, say, a privileged neighborhood in the city of Bonn, versus if you grew up in a township like Soweto in South Africa, your starting points are completely different. But whether you choose to address gender equality, climate change, human rights, economic justice, whatever, it doesn't, in my judgment, really matter. What matters more is actually getting off your butt and getting involved in the first instance. But whatever area you choose to get involved in, let's say you say, I'm going to be a climate change activist, or you say, I'm going to be a person who works for workers' rights. All you need to do is, irrespective of where you choose as your starting point, is ask yourself, how does my starting point connect with other people's starting points? How can my work be supported by other people in other movements and other efforts, and then how can my effort actually support those other efforts in the areas that you choose not to particularly put your energies in. So long as one has a sense of integrating your efforts with what others are doing and not operate in a silo and don't think that, oh, if I choose climate change or if I choose human rights and I do it really well, then the world is going to be saved. No, the world will only be saved by people connecting the different struggles that we face and being able to do it in a way that respects the efforts of others while, focusing on. So essentially it comes down to finding the right balance between what I would call specialization and parochialism, right? Because we need people to specialize and be really strong in certain areas. You can't be a specialist in every area, right? But there's one thing being specializing and another thing being parochial, where you become so narrow in your thinking, you think nothing else exists. So finding the balance between specialization and parochialism, I think, is the challenge for any young or older person thinking about getting involved in working for a more just world.
So you changed your kind of starting point where you worked. You were the head of Greenpeace for 6 years. And now you're working more at the basis and for the organization Africa Rising. Can you tell us something about this? What is behind this? And maybe first of all, why did you change this position from the head of an organization to, like you said before in the lecture, more like a bottom type organization now you're working with?
Throughout my more than 35 years of activism now, I have always strongly felt that what is more important is the issue, the cause, and the purpose of what you're trying to do. The vehicle, the actual institutional vehicle, important as it is, should always be less important than the end result of what you're struggling for. So for me, I've moved over the years from, basically being part of a human rights movement, the anti-apartheid movement, trying to defeat a very vicious system called apartheid. Then I worked in adult education and adult literacy campaigns. Most of my NGO work was actually in education. So you think, well, how does a kind of progressive, kind of radical thinking guy go and work in adult education? Simple. If people do not have the ability to read and write, how can they participate in public life? It's a recipe of shutting people out of engagement. And that is why the architect of apartheid, Hendrik Vervoet, said very eloquently, quote, "Blacks should never be shown the greener pastures of education. They should know that the station in life is to be cutters of wood and carriers of water," right? That's how the system was built, the apartheid system. So, from there I went on to, civil society strengthening work, anti-poverty work and so on. So the organizations are less important for me. And the question is, because I am a feminist and I've been involved in the women's movement for a long time, I embrace this notion of intersectionality. So I've had it from a young age. And so moving from one area to the other doesn't mean that you're giving up on one and you're just saying, it's just where your emphasis. Right now, though, I feel that if we're brutally honest, that I cannot see how existing organizations can deliver the solutions that we need. We need to rethink organizational strategies, our theories of change. Like, for example, on climate, historically we've spent a lot of time campaigning against individual companies that do bad things that take us closer to the climate cliff. I don't think we have time anymore. There are too many companies doing bad things. So one of the things I'm working on and advocating for is, let's follow the money, and rather campaign against individual organizations that do climate destructive economic activity, let's go after banks and other lending institutions. And if we can stop the flow of capital at source, right, and if we got 20 banks in the world to say we won't lend to deforestation related activities, to oil, gas, coal activities, if we've got 20 banks, I tell you, it's going to be much more effective. So that's the kind of thing. And today we must learn from young people what young people have taught the world in the creative way they've used social media to raise awareness, push agendas, build networks, and so on. And I suspect in the future, that the kinds of organizations that are going to be more successful are not necessarily like the existing organizations that are big and bureaucratic and slow and are heavy brand names, but it's going to be more light-footed activism where we set up informal networks for a purpose, we put pressure, and then we take that energy and transform it in different ways. Africans Rising is trying to take the best from what this more decentralized form of organizing allows, and we take what we learn from more traditional forms of, and so we're trying to make a hybrid between the two, but more clearly we are trying to go for a more decentralized approach. For me, you know, titles don't matter, being the head of something doesn't matter. I'm in for the cause, and I would advise other people to be like that way as well, because at the end, organizations are just vehicles, they're not the purpose of why we exist. It is for a purpose, and the purpose should be the driver always.
Maybe let us continue this little thought. You said you need to change the system. Do you think it's just done by talking with the politics and saying that the politician must change something and change the rules of the game, or do you think you must really change the system above? So, like you said in the lecture, that it's, I don't have it right from the pronunciation, but the thing with the no borders, it's like that it's kind of strange that we have this nation. It's not strange from the historical ground, but it's not really logical to have this one system. No.
You see, this is a very good question, because how you make change happen is not about you having an idea and you project your consciousness on the people that you are organizing, right? You have to, good activism always starts with where people are at, right? So when I was very young, as a 16-year-old, I think I learned this wisdom from Asia, which said, go to the people, live with them, learn from them, build on what they know, build on their capabilities, so that when the struggle has been won, people should say, we have done it ourselves, rather than somebody from somewhere came and helped them achieve it. Why I give you that example is, I think, yes, we need fundamental systemic and structural change, true. But to do that doesn't mean you have to disrespect a person who's running a children's home for 12 young boys. I did that for 2 years. When I was very young, 19, 20, I lived in a children's home. I was the house father for 12, 14 boys, depending which period it was, right? And there were some people who said to me, what's wrong with you? You're a reformist. You're only going and working with these 14 boys. You should ask yourself the question, why are those boys there in the first place? And if you ask yourself that question, you know the apartheid system has put them there, and therefore all your energies should go towards apartheid. Now, I didn't see any contradiction between the energies that I was living with for 2 years with these amazing young boys who shaped my life, right? Because basically, the way I did that work, I connected it to the bigger question. And so when the cops came after me, you know, to arrest me and so on, there were people in our community who actually said, we're going to stand with Kumi, not because I was saying all the radical progressive things, because they saw some humanity in me. They saw that actually this is a guy who gave up, you know, partying with his friends to look after in the age of 19 and 20, and you know that's one of the big parting times, right, in our lives. And people sort of saw the humanity of that contribution. And so when I said this apartheid system should be overthrown, people took me seriously. If I just parachuted it in and said the apartheid system should be overthrown, people say, well, yeah, okay, I might or might not agree with you, but who are you? What track record you got? You haven't shown that you really care about anybody, and so on. I'm not saying that I did it solely because of a strategic, tactical thing. I had a personal reason to do it because my mom committed suicide a few years earlier, and if anything, the boys helped me more than I helped the boys. But I think, you know, we must be careful about thinking in too siloed and separate ways, because unfortunately the world is much too messy where things can start and finish at one point. So these things are overlapping, and I think the challenge is figuring out how they overlap. I will never say to any individual who says, oh, I am going to do some work to help 5 people. If they say, I'm going to help 5 women who are survivors of domestic violence and set up a shelter, I'm not going to say to them, oh, actually, you know what, you only have being 5 women. If you really want to help women, you should lobby for a domestic violence act, and so on and so forth. Yes, I would say to those 5, to the woman working with 5 people, I would encourage her to connect what she's doing to the bigger policy advocacy struggles around gender equity, but I would not disrespect what she's doing. My first starting point would be to respect what she's doing and help her connect to the bigger picture. And that's the way I think we need to moving forward. Not just on one struggle, but on all the different struggles we have.
All right. All right. So, but maybe the question is, where do I can start, or is it, or how, as a young person now, when I hear you and I listen to you, the next questions, which mainly would come to the mind of the listeners and the viewers, how do I start to make change if they got connected with you through a speech or something like that? So, how do you start?
Mahatma Gandhi said, "Be the change you want to see in the world." I think the first thing is we should all look at our own lives. Ask ourselves, can we reduce our footprint on the planet? How can we live more environmentally sensitive lives? How do we, beyond environmental considerations, how do we engage? The thing is, if you don't make an effort, for example, to reach out and to engage with people who might come from different backgrounds and so on, you'll never discover the world. If you always are wanting to be with familiarity and be with people you grew up with who might all look and act and think the same that you do, you're never going to broaden your horizon. So I would say to people, firstly, I should have said it in that speech, I'll say it in this evening, activism is fundamentally sexy. It doesn't have to be a kind of, oh God, I'm being an activist, it's such a burden and so on. No, activism can be fun. Today when I look at my life, my best friends, the people who I trust the most, who have helped me the most throughout my life, were people I grew up with in my first years of activism, right? And when I'm sad or I'm happy and I want to share, these are the people I go to, And so if I can be brutally honest, many people when they describe me and present me at conferences and all, are sort of saying, presenting me in a way like, oh, this guy has contributed so much, he's done so much and so on. I'm not saying this just to be nice or to be immodest. There is not a single moment of doubt in my mind that if at all I have contributed anything to any movement or any cause that I've been involved in, what I contributed is negligible and minuscule compared to what I gain as a human being in terms of meaning, value of my own life, and the sense of having a life of purpose. I gain much more than I've contributed. So I say to people, don't pressure yourself, right? Don't rush to, and don't feel, oh, the world is falling apart, I need to get involved, so let me rush. And take a deep breath, look at all the options, there are many. Choose that which feels most comfortable for you in your lifestyle. Listen, if you're a single mom and you have responsibilities for a young child and you have to work and you want to be involved, how exactly you choose to get involved is going to be different from a student who can get away with attending 3 days lectures and doing activism on 2 days full-time. So all I would say is understand that there's going to be a diversity of entry points, a diversity of time, a diversity of focus, and so on. And the other thing is, I would say people must also look at their talents. If you're a singer, you're a poet, you're an artist, you're a technology person, look at your skill and say, can my skill be helpful and how can I deploy that skill? Because if you are using a skill that you have or a competency that you have, one is you're going to be good at it, you're going to help a movement maybe fill a gap of skills that didn't exist. And the other thing is you're going to enjoy it, right? And you might even take learnings from your contribution for your full-time work or other projects that you're engaged in. So I wouldn't be prescriptive. I wouldn't feel comfortable to say you should start here or start there. I would say you should start, right? And what I would say, like I would say to people in the environment field, for example, recycling is a very good place to start it's a terrible place to stop. You know what I mean? Like that, you know, so where people start, irrespective of where people start, those that have been around for longer should embrace it, encourage it, applaud it. But if then people say, well, that's it, then you can start putting pressure and saying, but you know, if you yourself just do recycling, but you don't say anything to your local government about creating better recycling facilities in the whole community or whatever, then how far are you going to go? But don't judge people who are trying to make a difference in a negative way, even if you and I might agree they need to go to more different levels of like more stronger activism. Rather than criticize, provide pathways that help people to get to the point where you want, and do it in a non-judgmental way.
All right, thank you. I know that your time isn't so much. I have two last questions. One is actually for the radio only. I'm sorry for the things. Maybe you can tell us your
for my radio voice now.
If you want, but you also have a radio voice when I hear it, right? So maybe you can tell our listeners what's your favorite song is, because at the end of the week we have this special show where we play the favorite songs of people, or maybe a music style we would like to prefer.
Okay, yes. Someone answer that question.
Yeah, only the question: what's your maybe favorite music style or your favorite song?
Okay, my favorite music style is in fact reggae, because reggae played a big role in the liberation struggle in South Africa. Right now, my most favorite song is a Creedence Clearwater Revival song, which is called Have You Ever Seen the Rain? And I sang it with some friends at an event, which ended up on Facebook, which embarrassed me terribly. But the reason I like the song is because I like songs when the lyrics don't seem obviously telling a story, right? But when you dig deeper into the lyrics, you can interpret a much more deeper meaning. So, have you ever seen the rain coming down on a sunny day? That's about the way I interpret it, and I understand that that's what they had in mind as well, but who knows for sure. It was about napalm being dropped on the people of Vietnam. It's an anti-war peace song. Have you ever seen the rain coming down on a sunny day? So I am very opposed to war. I think all war is a failure of humanity. There is no war that's a victory. There's no war that's a success. That doesn't mean that I'm a fundamental pacifist in the conventional sense. But right now, given that I hardly ever sing, that I stupidly mustered up the courage under the urgings of my friend to sing in front of 200 people recently that song, I think I'd say that's my favorite song for now.
All right. Then the last question would also be for another show, or maybe also for us personally more a little bit. So do you have a kind of literature you would say? You can read this if you want to get to know more about the topic climate change or environmental politics or about poverty, and because it's really hard to get different point of views from the world, and so it's always nice if people like you or other reference can tell us about something they use for their work or enjoy in their free time.
Okay, so if you're looking for a book which looks at the complexity of climate and economics, I would recommend Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus Climate. If you're looking for a book that helps you think about organizational strategies and tactics, I would recommend a book called Spider versus Starfish, The Unstoppable Power of Leaderless Organizations. Why spider and starfish? Spider is hierarchically structured, you chop its head, it dies. A starfish, you chop off one of the thingamajigs, actually they're called arms. They grow into another starfish, and you take that. It's about decentralized versus centralized organizations. And if you're looking for something to give you a sensitive, humane understanding of poverty and what it means in real terms, I would recommend a book from India by Rohinton Mistry called A Fine Balance. There are many other books I can recommend, but I think 3 is probably enough, right?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks.
Thank you.